The night I remember most didn't start with noise, but with silence, the kind that makes you aware of every movement inside a building. I was at the lodge front desk after midnight staring at the guest book when I noticed the pages shift as if someone had brushed past. But the hallway was empty, and the only footprints in the snow outside belonged to a single man who'd checked in earlier. His car was still buried in the drift, untouched. That was when I realized the back door latch had been drawn from the inside. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever spent the night somewhere that felt off the moment you stepped inside. And if these stories help you drift through the dark, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened, though I'm 56 now. Back then, I worked the front desk at a mountain lodge in Colorado, a place meant for ski weekends and quiet retreats. It wasn't a glamorous job, but I liked the stillness of the nights, the wood smoke in the air, and the way the snow softened every sound. Most winters were predictable cold, busy on the weekends, slow during the week. But this night came during one of those heavy storms that swallowed the roads and left the building feeling like an island cut off from the rest of the world. The lodge wasn't large, 2 floors, maybe 20 rooms, with a wide stone fireplace in the lobby and a long carpeted hallway leading toward the guest wings. That evening, only a few rooms were booked. One couple had gone to bed early after a long drive, and another guest had canceled because of the storm. The only person who actually walked through the door was a man who paid in cash, signed the register without a word, and took his key. I remember him because he didn't remove his gloves or hat, even when I asked him to initial the form. His handwriting was small and neat, but the name he wrote down looked more like a placeholder, something too common, like John Smith. He never corrected me, never offered more. I simply marked him in as checked and handed him the brass key to room 6. By then, Len Turner, our overnight maintenance man, had already begun his rounds. Len was steady, mid-40s, slow-moving, the kind of man who fixed what was broken without making conversation. He liked to walk the halls with a tool belt slung low on his hip, the jingling of the keys letting you know he was nearby. I trusted him to notice things before I did. Around 1 in the morning, the storm hit harder. The windows rattled, and the lodge lights flickered, once, then steadied again. I called the county line for an update, but the phones hissed with static. The generator tested itself automatically, humming alive, before returning to idle. I logged it like routine, but the sound lingered. Not long after I decided to make a sweep of the guest hallway. The carpets muffled my steps, but the building had that hollow resonance you only hear when it's nearly empty. Most doors were closed, but when I passed room 6, I paused. No light shone under the frame, but I heard something faint, a chair scraping maybe, or the hush of someone moving carefully. I thought little of it until I came back 30 minutes later and noticed the same sound again. It wasn't loud, just deliberate, like someone rearranging furniture in slow motion. I almost knocked, but something stopped me. Guests were entitled to privacy, and I told myself it was nothing unusual. Still, I mentioned it to Len when I found him checking the boiler. He frowned and said he hadn't seen the man come downstairs since he'd checked in. He hadn't asked for extra blankets, hadn't come for water. Just silence, except for that muffled movement behind the door. We both shrugged it off, though the memory of that scraped sound stayed with me. By 2, the storm had cut the road off entirely. The plows wouldn't be through until morning. I was at the front desk again, filing receipts, when the guest book shifted slightly under my hand. I'd left it open to the page the man had signed, and I swear the paper moved as though pressed by air. The draft couldn't have done it. Every door was closed, every window sealed. I called for Len on the radio, but his line only gave a sharp burst of static before cutting off. I tried again, same thing. Finally, I pulled on my coat and walked down the back hallway toward the utility rooms. That was when I saw the rear exit door. The latch was turned. Snow had piled up against the threshold outside, but not a single footprint disturbed it. Whatever had opened the door hadn't gone into the storm. When I found Len a few minutes later, he was pale and uneasy. He asked if I'd been walking the second-floor hallway. I told him no. I'd been at the desk. He said he'd heard someone pacing overhead, steady steps from one end to the other, even though every upstairs room was empty. We checked together. Each door was locked, each room vacant. Yet the carpet in the hallway had fresh depressions, the kind shoes leave when snow melts into the fibers. But there was no snow, no trace of anyone carrying it in. Just the faint shape of footprints that ended halfway down the corridor and vanished. We didn't talk much after that. Len returned to the boiler room, muttering something about bad wiring, and I stayed at the desk, staring at the register. The name the man had written was there, in neat, tiny letters, but the more I looked at it, the more I doubted it. Not the handwriting, the word itself. It no longer looked like a name at all. More like a string of letters arranged to look right, but when you studied it, the meaning fell apart. The storm pressed on the windows. The building groaned and the hours dragged. I never saw the guest again. By dawn, room 6 was empty. The bed looked unused, and the key was resting neatly on the inside of the door as if it had been left before anyone stepped in. The register still held his false name, and the faint depressions in the upstairs carpet remained until the cleaning crew arrived days later. I sometimes wonder if Len and I imagined it all, if the storm and the silence played tricks on us. But whenever the weather turns heavy and the night goes still, I remember the scrape of that chair, the open latch on the back door, and the empty snow outside. And I still can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever checked in that night hadn't been looking for a bed. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people tilt their head, searching your expression for a hint of exaggeration, and then quietly decide you must have imagined it. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Back in the fall of 1994, I was working nights with the West Virginia State Police. I was 29, stationed near Summersville, a quiet posting with long stretches of dark roads and small town disturbances. It wasn't exciting work most of the time, but I liked it. The mountains had a rhythm of their own, and those back roads forced you to slow down to listen. Nights out there were long and hushed, broken only by the occasional voice crackling over the radio. I remember the season clearly. The leaves were starting to turn, painting the hills in sharp reds and oranges, and the air had that particular kind of stillness that comes before winter. That night I had the highway mostly to myself, headlights brushing against endless pine and asphalt. The cruiser hummed steady, and the radio gave only faint static, the kind you get when a storm is still hours away, but already pressing against the edges of the county. Just past 11, dispatch called about a possible stolen sedan, a gray Oldsmobile out of Charleston, last seen heading north on Route 19. I was about 10 miles south, running an easy stretch of road, so I turned off at the next ramp and waited. The highway was nearly empty, just an occasional set of taillights fading into the distance. When I finally saw the Oldsmobile, it was driving under the speed limit, steady, no swerves, no signs of panic. Almost too steady. I tailed it for a mile, watching the plate through the windshield glare. It matched the report down to the digit. I hit the lights. The car didn't run. It slowed, neatly pulled off onto a wide gravel shoulder that edged into the trees. I radioed in the stop, gave dispatch the number, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, damp, with the kind of mountain mist that settles low and doesn't quite lift. Gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the driver's side. My hand hovered near the holster, not tense, just habit. The windows were tinted slightly fogged from the inside, which struck me as strange, because the air wasn't cold enough for that. I could see the faint silhouette of someone sitting there still and waiting. I came closer, maybe 6 or 7 feet, and that was when everything shifted. The air thickened in a way I can't describe. Not cold, not warm, just heavy. The sound of my own steps seemed to dull, as if I'd dipped underwater. I blinked once. When my eyes focused again, the driver's seat was empty. The engine idled. The headlights burned against the gravel and the keys sat in the ignition. But the car was empty. No door had opened. No one had moved. It was simply unoccupied, as though the figure had evaporated between one heartbeat and the next. I opened the door carefully. The cabin smelled faintly of burnt rubber, sharp and metallic. The seats were warm, but there was no sign of a passenger. I checked the back. Nothing. I circled around, popped the trunk. It held only a stained floor mat and a faint chemical odor I couldn't place. By now, my throat was dry. I reached for my radio, but all I got was a piercing whine, like feedback stretched into a single note. I retreated to my cruiser, tried the dash unit, and it was the same static bursts of sharp interference. The Oldsmobile sat there humming quietly, but the rest of the world was silent. No crickets, no wind, not even the faint echo of highway noise. Just silence, complete and unnatural. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes waiting for something, anything to break that quiet. Eventually the radio clicked back to life as though nothing had happened. Dispatch's voice came through clear, asking for an update. I reported the vehicle as abandoned and requested backup, but my words felt shaky, inadequate. I didn't tell them what I'd really seen. How could I? Another unit arrived maybe 15 minutes later, but by then the Oldsmobile was gone. I mean, completely gone. I turned my head for less than a minute to scan the tree line, and when I looked back, the shoulder was empty. No sound of an engine, no taillights receding, just absence. We searched the gravel, but the tracks looked ordinary, fading off into the dust. My dash camera should have caught everything, but when we reviewed the tape, it froze. At the moment, I walked behind the car. Locked frame, no movement until the recording cut out altogether. The text said the file was corrupted. I'd never seen anything like it, and neither had they. The next morning, a local hunter named Dale Caldwell called in something strange. He claimed he'd been near Gauley Mountain just before sunrise and saw a patrol car parked off a game trail deep in the woods. He swore the headlights were on and someone sat behind the wheel. But as he got closer, the car simply wasn't there anymore. He sounded embarrassed, but certain. He even described the markings state police insignia, exact number sequence details. He shouldn't have known unless he really saw it. We followed his directions that afternoon. Sure enough, we found tire tracks leading into the trees, looping in a wide circle before stopping in the middle of a clearing. No exit trail, just an abrupt end like the vehicle had been lifted off the ground and removed. The center of the clearing smelled faintly of ozone and copper, and the pine needles there were dead in a perfect 10-foot ring. I stood at the edge, but I didn't step inside. Something in me knew better. By the end of that week, the stolen Oldsmobile turned up on a dirt road 10 miles away. It was parked neatly clean in a way no roadside vehicle ever is. No prints, no dust in the wheel wells, not even pollen on the windshield. It looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. We tested it every way we knew how, but it gave us nothing. I never filed the real version of the report. The official paperwork says suspect fled scene vehicle later recovered. That's technically true, but it's not the truth I lived. For years afterward, I would wake in the middle of the night, convinced I heard tires crunching over gravel or the faint hiss of a radio squelch at my window. But when I checked, the street would be empty. It's been 3 decades, and I still avoid that stretch of Route 19. Every now and then, though, when I'm scanning stations on a long drive, I'll catch a flash of that same static, just a second of it before the frequency clears. And each time I find myself gripping the wheel tighter, half afraid that if I look into the rearview mirror, I'll see a gray Oldsmobile following just close enough to disappear again. I grew up believing the safest job in the department was the one nobody noticed. Push papers, organize files, stay out of the spotlight. That's why I spent most of my career in records. Quiet work, stable hours, no real danger. But in the spring of 2018, I learned that danger doesn't always come from dark alleys or armed suspects. Sometimes it waits in boxes no one wants opened. I was 44 then, a few years into a transfer that put me in the evidence division. The space we worked in sat below the main station on Pratt Street, buried so far underground that people jokingly called it the Crypt. It wasn't a flattering name, but it fit. The air smelled of damp cardboard and ink, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a way that made the room feel timeless. Some of the boxes down there had been stacked since the 80s yellow tape clinging stubbornly to collapsing edges. Most of my work was dull but predictable. Scan old logs, cross-check inventory, make sure nothing had been misplaced before we digitized the files. On March 12th, I opened a box labeled Case 93047A Maria Lopez. Inside was a sealed kit slides and clothing samples, but the attached report listed a different woman entirely, a Janice Freeman. I knew that name. Her case had been dismissed in 1993, chalked up to insufficient evidence and lack of cooperation. Except in this file, she wasn't listed as a victim. She was marked as a suspect. At first, I assumed it was a clerical mistake. After decades of shifting paper, things ended up in the wrong places all the time. But the kit itself hadn't been processed, even though it carried a lab reference number. I checked the system for the number. Nothing. No log, no test, no acknowledgement that it even existed. That was the first time I felt a coldness in my stomach, that had nothing to do with the underground air. I ran the box ID through our digital archive to check the chain of custody. What I found made my skin prickle. The file had been accessed and edited earlier that same morning, hours before I even clocked in. But the access log showed no badge, no authorized user. The last official record was from 2004. I asked IT about it. A technician named Marcus checked for me, expecting to find a simple glitch. When he came back, he looked confused. He told me there was no record of anyone touching that file, digital or physical. Yet I had the box in front of me sitting on my desk with contents that didn't match the paperwork. I told myself I'd let it go, but the unease followed me. I spent the afternoon combing through old inventory lists. Before long, I'd flagged 6 more kits from the early 90s, all of them misfiled, mislabeled, or tagged to unrelated cases. Some carried no victim names at all, while others had been marked destroyed, even though they sat sealed in the boxes right in front of me. That evening, I wrote everything into my audit log and carried it to my supervisor, Carla. She barely glanced at it before telling me to hold off and leave the boxes where they were. Her tone was clipped, rehearsed, as if she'd been waiting for me to bring it up. That was when the pit in my stomach shifted into something sharper, closer to fear. The next morning, I arrived early. My chair was pulled back slightly, and the drawer where I kept my badge and notebook was ajar. On the keyboard sat a folded piece of printer paper. No envelope, no header. Just one line typed in bold letters, "Let the past stay buried." I stared at it until my hands shook. When I showed it to Carla later, she barely reacted. She said it was a prank, tossed the note into the shred bin, and told me I was letting the files get into my head. The casual way she dismissed it frightened me more than the message itself. By afternoon, my keycard no longer opened the lower level. Carla said the project had been paused and reassigned to another unit. My new task was digitizing old parking citations. She didn't answer when I asked if this was related to what I had found. She just kept typing her expression flat. That night at home, I was sitting on the couch when the doorknob rattled. It wasn't a knock or a mistaken jiggle. It was a slow, deliberate twist, the kind of movement someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. I froze. My porch light was on, but when I looked through the peephole, the steps were empty. Then, under the glow of the street lamp at the end of my lawn, I saw a figure. Not moving, not walking, just standing too still. I blinked, and the spot was empty again. The next day, I tried to report everything what I'd found. The note, the figure outside. Internal Affairs sat me with an officer named Reynolds. He jotted a few lines, nodded politely, and cut me off with a quiet, "We'll look into it." A week later, when I followed up, there was no record of my statement. My complaint had been erased as cleanly as those files in the basement. I tried contacting the lab that supposedly processed the kits. They told me they'd never received half of the IDs I gave them. I called numbers tied to the original victims, but most were disconnected. One woman answered and hung up immediately when I identified myself. Another number traced back to the widow of a retired officer who'd handled one of the cases. She spoke only long enough to whisper, "Don't call here again," before the line went dead. I felt like I was pulling at threads on a sweater someone had already burned. Every lead crumbled as soon as I touched it. By May, I resigned. The official paperwork says personal reasons. Unofficially, I couldn't walk into that building without feeling eyes on me. Not from coworkers or cameras, but something colder. Something that whispered I'd seen enough. I kept copies of what I could, scanned logs, screenshots, photos of the mismatched kits before they locked the room. Sometimes I think about sending them to a journalist. But then I remember the note on my keyboard, the rattle at my door, and the look on Carla's face when she told me to drop it. It wasn't apathy I saw. It was fear, deep and real, as if she already knew what happens to people who don't. I've since moved to another state, new job, new neighborhood. But sometimes when I walk out to the trash late at night, the stillness feels heavy, and I remember that basement. I remember the boxes no one wanted opened, and the sentence typed in clean, black letters. Let the past stay buried. I used to think nothing in my career could rattle me after a decade on the job. I'd seen plenty of strange things in the city calls that didn't add up, suspects who seemed to vanish into thin air, accidents that defied explanation. But what happened to me, to my colleagues, and even to my own family, one fall not long ago, well, it still lingers with me in the quietest moments when the house is dark and my son is asleep upstairs. I was 36 at the time, working out of the 105th precinct in Queens. Most of my shifts were daytime by then, a choice I'd made, so I could be home with my boy Noah in the evenings. Things were steady. I had a good partner, a rhythm to my days, and enough routine to make the job feel manageable. That was until I first heard about the SUV. It came up casually in briefing. Officer Chris Medina mentioned it like a footnote. A matte black SUV, heavily tinted windows, same license plate reported 4 different times, circling a few blocks in Springfield Gardens. Each caller described the plate exactly down to the last digit. The odd part was that the plate belonged to a vehicle already in impound, sitting locked in a lot across Brooklyn. We shrugged it off at first. It sounded like a mix-up, maybe someone cloning plates, maybe a prank. These things happen. But more calls followed. Different people from different streets described the same vehicle. Slow, deliberate. Always circling. Never stopping. One man said the driver slowed enough to look at him and smiled, though he couldn't see the man's face, only the faint outline of a head in the shadows. We checked traffic cams for every sighting. Nothing, not one frame of the SUV. It was as though it didn't exist on camera. I didn't think about it much again until one night when it became personal. I'd just pulled into my driveway after picking up dinner. Noah was in the back seat, half asleep, and the street was quiet under the soft glow of those low amber lights that make everything feel hushed. That's when I noticed it. 2 houses down, parked against the curb, sat a black SUV. Engine off, lights out, someone sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat. I froze there in the car longer than I'd like to admit. My first instinct was to get Noah inside. I walked him in, told him to start his homework, and stepped back out with my phone already dialing. Chris came rolling up in his cruiser within minutes, but by the time he arrived, the SUV was gone. No sound of an engine pulling away, no lights, no trace on my doorbell cam. The footage caught me pulling in, then Chris pulling up, nothing in between. 10 minutes erased. Over the next week, the strangeness bled into my daily life. Gates I knew I'd latched were standing open in the morning. The smell of engine grease lingered near my back door. One night I found Noah's bedroom window open, even though I'd locked it myself before bed. I told myself it was stress. Maybe I was misremembering. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Then Medina showed up at work one morning looking wrecked, dark circles under his eyes. He told us he'd seen it himself, parked outside his apartment. When he approached with a flashlight, the SUV's headlights flicked on, and it reversed down the block in silence. No engine noise, no tires on pavement, just motion like a film played backward with the sound stripped out. More calls kept coming in. Parents said the SUV parked near schools. One colleague, Terrence Fields, reported it watching his daughter's building across the street. A security guard confirmed it had been there for 2 hours. But again, when we checked cameras, there was nothing. We began to sense it wasn't just a car, or at least not in the ordinary sense. It felt like something was playing with us, choosing when to be seen and when to vanish. The worst moment for me came on a Friday evening. I got home and found a manila envelope sitting on my porch. Inside was a single photograph, Noah and me on the couch. The angle was from inside the house, taken through the living room window. But the camera had been inside behind us. Nothing in the house was missing or broken, but someone had been there. Someone had stood in the room long enough to aim, frame, and capture us without our knowledge. I barely slept after that. Every curtain stayed drawn, every light stayed on, and I kept my service weapon on the nightstand. I started pacing in the small hours, staring at the windows, listening for sounds. The SUV stopped appearing for a few days, but Medina swore he got a call from an unknown number, telling him flatly, "Let it go, officer. You're not supposed to see it." He transferred out of Queens not long after. For me, the breaking point came 2 nights later. I pulled up after a late shift and saw my front door standing open just a crack. Noah was at a friend's house, so I knew he wasn't home. I entered carefully, weapon drawn, every creak of the floor echoing in my chest. The kitchen and living room were untouched, but in Noah's bedroom the carpet showed muddy footprints, not leading in or out, just 2 prints planted in the middle of the room. Taped to the closet door was another photograph. This one was worse. It showed me asleep in bed. The picture had been taken from the foot of the mattress. The grain, the angle, the faint glow of the clock, every detail said 3 in the morning. My blood went cold. That night, I didn't pack a bag. I simply grabbed Noah, our IDs, my badge, and checked us into a cheap hotel. I paid cash and told the clerk not to write down our names. I sat awake in the dark all night, staring at the window, listening for sounds that never came. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. No more calls to dispatch, no more sightings, no more envelopes. The SUV vanished as if someone flipped a switch. Even the muddy prints in Noah's room were gone. When I finally returned home, the carpet cleaned as if nothing had ever been there. I've spent a lot of nights since then wondering why. Why target officers? Why appear to families? Why use a plate from an impounded car? None of it makes sense. Chris won't talk about it. Medina moved away. Terrence refuses to answer questions, but I still find myself glancing out the window late at night, not because I expect to see it, but because part of me wants to, just to know it was real. Back in 2016, I thought I'd finally found a rhythm to the work. My role was technical, tucked away from the front lines, and I preferred it that way. I was 34, working as a digital evidence analyst with the LAPD, which meant long hours combing through footage, labeling timestamps, and making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and the quiet suited me. At least it did, until I opened a drive one evening that never should have existed. I lived alone at the time, in a modest apartment just off Sunset. The walls were thin, the pipes rattled when the neighbors used the shower, but I liked the anonymity of the place. Most nights I'd bring home hard drives to review, letting the footage play across my second monitor while I sipped tea and made notes. Usually the material was routine parking garages, alleyways, convenience stores, always angles just outside the edges of a crime scene. That spring I was assigned to a string of small burglaries around the downtown residential blocks. Nothing major, just stolen electronics and forced entries, but the pattern was odd. All the victims lived within a 3-block stretch, and each case carried the same quiet unease. In their reports, small details about things moved, pets acting strangely, windows that had been locked but found open. I assumed the oddities would explain themselves once I reviewed the raw pulls from nearby cameras. It was late when I started going through the folders, the kind of hour when the apartment around me felt suspended in silence. Most of the footage was predictable grainy garage entrances, stairwell landings, alley corners. Then I opened one labeled KM23 Park North. Instead of an exterior view, it showed the inside of a small kitchen. The refrigerator was covered in magnetic poetry, and in the corner a wireless router blinked steadily. The angle was high, almost from the ceiling. The timestamp matched the night of one of the burglaries. At first, I thought maybe a tenant had submitted private security footage and someone mislabeled the file. But there was no accompanying note, no mention of a private camera in the case file. Curious, I opened another folder, CAM26 Garage. It should have shown a vehicle entrance, but instead it displayed a dimly lit bedroom. The bed was unmade. A floor lamp stood in the corner and nothing moved except the faint shift of curtains from the air vent. That was when my stomach tightened. These weren't hallway cameras, these were interiors. I kept digging. Each mislabeled file matched the apartment of someone who'd reported a break-in. A man reading the paper on his couch. A woman brushing her hair in the mirror, the angle too perfect to be anything but a hidden lens. Every image looked deliberate, chosen. And the quality wasn't from cheap webcams or home security devices. These were clean controlled like professional surveillance. By the time I reached the last folder, I was sweating despite the cool air from the vent above me. The file was tucked into a mislabeled directory called KM34 Dump. When I clicked it open, the feed froze me where I sat. It was my own apartment, same couch, same coffee stain on the armrest. The clip was only a few days old, captured while I was at work. The camera's perspective was high near the ceiling fan. Worse, the image zoomed slightly whenever someone passed through the frame, as if it was being controlled by hand. I checked every corner of the room, behind the vents, under the shelves, even inside the smoke detector. I found nothing, just drywall dust and my own racing pulse. The next morning, I went straight to Itihi. Marcus, one of the techs I trusted, ran a metadata scan on the drive. His voice wavered when he told me there was no record of the files ever being pulled, logged, or uploaded into our system. According to the database, they had never existed. I should have stopped then, But the idea of those cameras inside private apartments, including mine, wouldn't let me rest. I went back through old burglary reports. One woman, Jennifer Hill, had written that her cat refused to enter her bedroom after the incident, hissing at the corner every night. Another victim, a man named Theo Morales, had woken to find his silverware laid out in perfect rows on the kitchen floor, though no one had forced the locks. At the time, these details had seemed eccentric, almost dismissible. Now they felt deliberate. I filed an internal request disguised as a systems audit, asking for records on building maintenance updates across the affected addresses. The logs that weren't erased all pointed to the same contractor, low secure tech. Their website was a blank template, no address, no working contact form. When I searched them through government systems, nothing appeared. No tax ID, no licensing. It was a company that didn't exist. That night, I brought home my backup copies on a small encrypted drive. I sat awake until dawn, playing clip after clip, trying to find a pattern, some anchor that made sense. My apartment was quiet, but I kept feeling like the air had been shifted, like someone had stood inside while I wasn't there. A few days later, every strange folder vanished from my backups one by one. At the same time, the original hard drive overheated and died, though I hadn't even plugged it in. When I called Marcus, his number was disconnected. By the end of the week, his office was empty. Someone said he'd put in for a transfer, but I had spoken with him only days earlier. I stopped using my apartment after that. I booked nights in a cheap motel under a false name, unplugged every device, and carried the drive with me in a jacket pocket. When I finally returned home, everything was in place, but different. The rug I'd kicked near the door had been flattened. My plants were watered. The space felt reset, as if someone had been through and erased the signs of me. I've since left that job, moved out of the city, and started over. But to this day, I can't enter a room without glancing at the corners, half expecting to see the faint blink of a hidden lens. I've told no one at work, no one in my family. The only proof left is a small, safe deposit box I keep under another name. Inside it rests a single drive with a handful of captured frames. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to remind me I wasn't imagining it. Because I know what I saw. I saw strangers in their kitchens, in their bedrooms, brushing their hair, reading the paper. And then I saw myself caught on a feed I never installed. That is the image that stays with me. Not the others, not the hidden company, not the erased files. The image of my own apartment lit by daylight I wasn't there to see, captured from a corner where no camera should have been. I don't usually talk about this because it sounds like the kind of road story truckers make up to spook rookies. But it happened in 2009, and I still have the napkin to prove it. I was 27 at the time, running loads between Chicago and Salt Lake, spending more nights in my cab than in any real bed. Life on the interstate was lonely, but I liked the silence. You learn to count on the glow of truck stops, the rhythm of way stations, the few steady places that reminded you weren't the only one awake out there. That night, I was cutting across the Nebraska Panhandle on Highway 26. The sky was flat and dark, no moon, no real stars. My logbook was pushing me toward a mandatory rest, so I started watching for one of those small rest areas tucked off the two-lane. Around midnight, I saw the faint glow of sodium lights and pulled in. It was a bare-bones stop, just a row of vending machines, under a concrete shelter, 2 picnic tables, and a bathroom that smelled like bleach and damp earth. I wasn't the only one there. Another rig sat idling near the tree line, its running lights glowing like faint embers. A man leaned against the cab, smoking. He looked older, maybe late 50s, with a cap pulled low and a reflective vest hanging loose over his jacket. I gave a nod, and he nodded back, the kind of quiet acknowledgement truckers share without words. Inside, the vending machines buzzed with that faint electric hum. I bought a coffee and a pack of crackers, sat down at one of the tables, and tried to relax. That was when I noticed the napkin. It was folded neatly under the plastic salt shaker, like someone had left it there, on purpose. Written in blocky black marker were the words, "You're almost out west, nothing else, no signature, no doodles." I figured maybe it was a joke from some kid or a tired driver scribbling nonsense, but the way it was folded so carefully waiting there unsettled me. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and tried not to think about it. When I stepped back outside, the other truck was gone. Not pulling out, not shifting gears, just gone, like it had never been there. No fading tail lights, no diesel echo rolling over the hills. I walked around to check the gravel, thinking maybe I'd missed it backing out, but there weren't any fresh tracks. Only my own rig sat humming in the stillness. I tried the bathroom before heading out again, but the lights inside flickered and buzzed like they were running on half power. One of the sinks dripped steadily, echoing louder than it should have in the tiled space. When I pushed open the stall door, I froze. Carved into the metal with something sharp were the same words from the napkin, "You're almost out west." That was enough. I hustled back to my truck, slammed the door, and locked it. The highway stretched empty in both directions, no headlights for miles. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe I'd seen a coincidence, some graffiti I hadn't noticed before. But when I reached for my coffee, the cup was gone. In its place, sitting neatly in the holder, was the folded napkin again. Same words, same black marker, as if it had followed me back out. I drove hard that night, pushing past my logbook limits, my eyes darting between the mirrors and the endless road ahead. Around 3 a.m., I caught sight of taillights in the distance. Another truck, same shape as the one I'd seen before, same faint glow of running lights near the trees. I closed the distance slowly, but no matter how fast I pushed, the truck stayed just ahead like it was leading me. Then, without warning, the lights vanished. Not faded, vanished. One moment there, the next gone into the black. By dawn, I reached a way station near Cheyenne. I pulled in, hands shaking, and forced myself to act normal while the patrol officer checked my papers. He was a younger guy, maybe my age then, with that polite, flat tone you hear from people who've seen it all. As he handed me back the logbook, I noticed he paused, his eyes flicking to the dashboard. The napkin was sitting there in plain view. "You get that out by the rest stop?" he asked. His voice was casual, but I could see something tighten in his jaw. I admitted I had. He nodded slowly and told me not to keep it, said it was better to throw it out and not think too much about the writing. When I pressed him, he only said a few other drivers had found similar notes over the years, always at those isolated pull-offs. None of the men he knew still drove long haul. Some just quit, others vanished off the circuit, never checked in again. I didn't throw mine away. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof it had been real. To this day, it's folded in a drawer back home, edges yellowing ink still sharp. I don't drive nights anymore, not since that trip. I stick to regional runs, daylight only, and when I see a rest stop glowing in the distance, I pass it by. Because if I stop, I know what I'll find. Another folded napkin waiting under a shaker or on a bathroom sink. Same words, same ink, same message written by a hand I never saw. You're almost out west, and the part that keeps me awake even now is wondering what happens when you finally get there. I used to spend weeks on the road for work, driving through towns most people only see off the highway signs. That life taught me a lot about empty places and the strange silences that sometimes fill them. In 2011, I had an overnight stop outside Paducah, Kentucky, at one of those rural motels that seemed forgotten by time. It was the middle of July, the air heavy and damp, and the sky had that washed-out look that comes after a day of thunderstorms. The motel was a single-story strip of doors, paint peeling with a flickering vacancy sign that hummed louder than it should have. I checked in around 9. The clerk was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes who slid the key across the counter without saying much. I remember how she never quite looked at me, only at the register, as if she wanted the transaction to be over quickly. My room was at the far end, number 14, with a window that faced a patch of gravel and weeds. Inside, the room had that stale smell of old air conditioning, a mix of mildew and dust baked into the curtains. I dropped my bag, turned on the lamp, and sat down with the papers I was supposed to review before the morning meeting. The TV was one of those old box models, snow hissing faintly between channels, so I left it on low for background noise. For a while, it felt like any other tired stop on the road. Sometime after midnight, I caught movement outside the window. The curtains were thin, the kind you could almost see through if the light was on inside. A man walked past slowly, his shoulders hunched. At first, I didn't think much of it. Guests wandered around motels all the time. But then I realized the footsteps never faded. He walked past again, the same slow pace, the same slouched posture. I only caught his outline, but something about the repetition made my skin crawl. I turned off the lamp, thinking I'd see him clearer against the faint glow of the parking lot. The man passed a third time, but now he was closer, his head angled as if he was looking in. I couldn't see his face, only the reflective shine of his jacket sleeve, catching the weak light. I waited, not moving, barely breathing, until he disappeared out of view. I wanted to call the front desk, but when I picked up the receiver, the line was dead. No dial tone, just silence. My cell had no signal either, which wasn't unusual in spots that rural, but it didn't help my nerves. I told myself to stay calm, that he was just another guest restless in the night. Still, I locked the door again, slid the chain across, and tried to settle back on the bed. Half an hour passed before I heard the knock. Not loud, not frantic, just a slow, deliberate rapping at the door. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I froze, every muscle tight, listening. He didn't speak, didn't move, just knocked again in that steady rhythm. I sat there in the dark until finally the sound stopped. When I worked up the courage to peek through the curtains, the lot was empty. No cars pulling out, no footsteps fading. Only the gravel, the weeds, and the distant buzz of the vacancy sign. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for morning light, my eyes darting back to that window over and over. At dawn, I went to the office to check out. The clerk was the same woman from before, her hands folded neatly on the counter. I mentioned the man I'd seen, the knocking, the way he circled the rooms. She looked at me a long moment, then quietly said that the motel hadn't had another registered guest that night. I asked about staff maintenance, anyone else who might have been around. She shook her head. Sometimes, she said, he just walks. I didn't press her. I didn't ask who he was supposed to be. I only took my receipt, left my key on the counter, and stepped back into the heavy morning air. Driving away, I glanced once in the mirror. A figure stood near the last row of rooms, motionless, watching the road. I didn't look back again. I've had plenty of nights on the road since then, but I've never gone back through Paducah, never stayed in another one-story motel with thin curtains, because I know what I'll see if I do the man passing the window, slow and deliberate circling until I notice. And maybe the next time, he won't just keep walking. That's the last story I'll share tonight. Looking back at all of them, I notice how ordinary the places were. Motels, rest stops, diners, highways, places people pass through without thinking, places that aren't supposed to hold on to you afterward. But sometimes they do. What unsettles me most is not the moments themselves, but how they linger years later, reshaped in memory, yet never dulled. A knock in the dark, a folded napkin, footsteps that don't match anyone present. Each one is simple, explainable on its own. Yet, taken together, they suggest something larger, a pattern of unease threaded through our lives like faint stitching. Maybe that's why these stories stay with us. Not because they prove anything, but because they whisper at the edge of certainty, reminding us that the world is less solid than we like to believe. And in those quiet hours of the night when the roads are empty and the lights flicker, it's easy to feel that reminder pressing closer. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I hope these stories kept you company tonight, wherever you happen to be listening. If you'd like to hear more, you can subscribe or share this with a friend who enjoys the quiet unease of late-night tales. And tell me, have you ever passed through a place that seemed ordinary at first, but left you unsettled long after you'd gone good night and be careful on the roads?